Yeah, the title of my presentation is Environmental Justice in the Electric Vehicle Supply Chain, the Case of Lithium Valley. I want to also acknowledge this work has been partially supported by an internship with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, but I am just speaking on behalf of myself today, and my views do not represent those of anyone else necessarily. I also want to acknowledge and thank Mariela Loera from the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. She has collaborated with me throughout this and also invited me into spaces and community meetings where I've been able to learn more about the community in the surrounding the Salton Sea and how they think about lithium extraction. Yeah, so the purpose of this presentation is really to just kind of show how I and my research niche, which is the value chain of electric vehicle batteries, how I'm trying to incorporate environmental justice into that. It's something that we've talked about a lot as students, has been kind of like, okay, we have this sense that we want to have more of an energy justice focus, but what does that mean? And especially in these disciplines that are kind of traditionally more quantitative, what would it actually look like to do that? So I'm just trying I'm just sharing how I'm trying to do that, but I definitely welcome feedback from anyone about what you think, and feel free to put comments in the chat throughout. Plus, I also went to the Salton Sea and took a lot of pictures and haven't been able to share them with anyone, so I'm also excited to put all those pictures in a presentation. All right, so to start off with today, I'm going to explain some of the key concepts in environmental justice literature, or try to explain them, that I think are really useful as a foundation to kind of provide a lens on looking at energy or material extraction issues and sort of how those concepts have been defined by people who are experts in this. Then I'm going to kind of switch gears and just give an overview of the electric vehicle battery supply chain, and kind of discuss that in the context of environmental justice more generally and how other people have studied it. And then I will talk more specifically about what's going on in the Salton Sea, and then just kind of share my thoughts on, given all that we can see and learn about in the Salton Sea, how I hope to kind of adjust the life cycle assessment and material flow analysis, which is the tools in industrial ecology, to kind of be more aligned with informing environmental justice in this particular case. Generally, the motivation for my research, and I know Jess shares this as well because we research basically the same things, but when I was a master's student in the energy graduate group, we were just hearing a lot about the plans to electrify transportation. You generate as much renewable electricity as possible, and then also use stationary storage to provide resilience and to provide power, basically, and deal with the intermittency of renewable energy. And I was thinking to myself during these lectures, like, this is a lot of batteries. I know batteries don't last forever. Like, where are they coming from? And then kind of what is the plan? And at that time, like, there's a ton has happened even just since now and then. This was in 2018, and 2019. And a lot has developed since then, but at the time, there was not really a satisfying answer, I felt, for what was going to happen to the batteries. And I also, yeah, there is also definitely a need to pay attention to how they're being mined and what the impacts are, as well as kind of what the process for developing those projects is. Okay, so getting into the key concepts in environmental justice, this has been described by David Schlossberg as a trivalent view of environmental justice. And that's broken down into distributive justice, which is looking at how burdens and benefits are distributed and kind of who is experiencing negative impacts, who is benefiting from a technology or material or process, and looking for kind of disparities and looking to lessen disparities in that space. But then two things that come along with this, and this is also drawing from the work of Nancy Fraser and Iris Young. But part of this is also recognizing what groups or communities may be involved, and ensure like valuing the kind of ways of knowing and cultures and experiences of all potential groups equally, and then also ensuring that all of the impacted groups are able to participate in decision-making processes that will affect them. And the reason that these are all related because, for example, distributive justice, if there's a community that is relatively has fewer resources, they probably don't have as much time or ability to participate in like public agency processes or how the decisions about natural resources are getting made. And then meanwhile, if they're not able to participate, then the people making the decisions aren't going to understand what they need or how something might affect them, and they're going to be kind of neglected from consideration. So those decision-making processes are kind of likely to reinforce this imbalance. And then recognition also really matters here because there may be certain groups that would need kind of specific accommodation to be able to participate. For example, that could be translation. It could mean holding meeting hours, meeting during different times that are more convenient for them, or support accessing the meetings. And so if the differences in groups and the ability to participate is not recognized, they won't be able to participate. And then all of these kind of cycles continue to reinforce themselves. So I think that like looking into and reading more about these three concepts and other authors who have done way more research about them than I have has been really helpful to me in kind of framing how we can understand the lithium-ion battery value chain. Okay, switching gears a bit. This is a graph from a paper that Jess and I worked on that just did all of the modeling for these. And these graphs are projecting the material demand just for electric vehicle batteries, although lithium-ion batteries are also used in consumer electronics and stationary storage. But some of the key materials that people tend to think about are cobalt, lithium, manganese, and nickel. These are all in the cathode of the battery. And what you can see here is it is going to grow by quite a bit. And then also particularly for lithium, no matter how cathode chemistries develop, unless demand for batteries levels off at some point, it's never going to actually become a circular economy. So policymakers talk about this a lot, about like circularity in the value chain. But if demand just grows exponentially, there's always going to be a need to mine new material. So I think for me, I take that to mean we should probably be thinking more about how to level off demand and how to use resources more efficiently to get people around, but also that you need to maximize recycling and also still pay attention to where the materials are coming from. And this is typically how this is studied. Most literature that's about this topic is life cycle assessment or material flow analysis. And it's pretty quantitative, and it tends to give general numbers. So like general volumes of materials demanded or retired. And then the environmental impacts are often quantified using life cycle assessment, which is also extremely quantitative and kind of reports a numerical value that's usually focused on the greenhouse gas emissions and occasionally with other impacts. So the critique of life cycle assessment often is that from political ecologists and geographers and those fields, is that by generalizing everything into a single score, it can erase who's experiencing negative impacts and who's experiencing positive impacts. So we can see here, these are, this is depicting mainly nickel, cobalt, and lithium. So lithium primarily is sourced from Australia and Chile. In Chile, it's mined, or it's extracted using evaporation ponds where brine is brought to the surface and then kind of concentrated using evaporation, and it uses quite a bit of land and water to complete that process. And then cobalt mainly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's mined as a co-product with nickel and copper often, and there's just a lot of violence and conflict and poverty associated with the material extraction of cobalt. And then nickel, the issues with nickel are, as particular in Indonesia, where this picture is from, is mainly around like habitat destruction and sulfur emissions and kind of negative local impacts there as well. And when you look at where these negative impacts are happening, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this is a place that has suffered from injustice and inequity for centuries, kind of as a result mainly of colonial legacy. And so it's kind of, it's an inequity that already existed and is kind of perpetuated if you through this metal trade. And then meanwhile, the positive benefits of electric vehicles mainly are going to be experienced by wealthier nations and wealthier people within those nations who can afford EVs and therefore kind of benefit from the improved air quality impacts of them. And there are other people who have written about this as well. Benjamin Sovacool is someone who has spoken to the Energy Graduate Group over the fall, and he calls this the Decarbonization Divide. Kramatz et al. Also wrote about conceptualizing about the impacts of clean energy technologies by looking at the displacement of populations. Agustinata and Liu are two researchers who have written some pretty interesting studies about the local impacts of lithium extraction in Chile. And then Newell and some other scholars in political economy and political ecology have written kind of just generally identifying these gaps in life cycle assessment and industrial ecology, and argued that there could be better knowledge creation by kind of incorporating political ecology and industrial ecology and bringing them together and kind of situating environmental impacts within the social and political contexts. Okay, are there any questions up to this point, or before I dive into the Salton Sea? I can't tell if I've been talking for a long time or if I really blew through that.
Hey Meg, I actually have a question. Don't expect you to actually have the answer, but you were talking about the Congo and how it's historically for centuries, experienced inequities. Do you see any connection between like the countries that maybe colonized those areas and like the companies that are actually doing the mining there?
Yeah. Oh man, I want to be careful with how I answer this, but because I couldn't answer for like specific mines or specific mining companies and their practices today. But a lot of the cobalt comes from the Katanga region, and the copper industry in that region was established by Belgian colonists, and generally colonization was through King Leopold, and they established these industries using like really disturbing and violent practices like forced labor. I think it's estimated that like 8 to 10 million people died during their colonial regime, and they also would like cut off people's hands if they didn't work. And like that's, I think, just, it's a very dark creation of the mining industry there. And they only gained independence in like 1959, I think. And I know, yeah, there's at least one company that is involved in minerals extraction and recycling that is a Belgian company and is still operational there, but I'm not sure how their practices have changed. So, but generally, I mean, nobody ever really talks about this when they're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo and cobalt as a conflict mineral, at least in the battery sphere. So it's not really like part of the conversation at this point, I would say.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was a good answer.
So now we come to the Salton Sea, because, and the Salton Sea, the area around the Salton Sea, I think there's a lot going on in terms of environmental justice, and it's a really interesting place. I've really never been anywhere like it. But the Salton Sea, the reason we're talking about this is because recently there's been interest in extracting lithium from geothermal brine in the Salton Sea. The geothermal industry has been operational there for a few decades. And so this has generated a lot of excitement from many people because the lithium extraction process of direct lithium extraction is considered to be more sustainable than evaporation or hard rock mining, because the electricity that it uses and the energy that it uses in general is generated by geothermal. And then it also, because it's relying on chemical processing to isolate the lithium rather than having this series of evaporation ponds, it requires a lot less water and a smaller land footprint. So people are excited about that. And then in the US, there's a lot of, actually, I guess everywhere, but in the US, there's a lot of emphasis on critical materials and wanting to minimize dependence on imports for these minerals that we rely on, such as lithium. And so having a domestic source of lithium is an exciting prospect. And then, as I will get into more, this region, people who live in this region suffer from a lot of challenges. And so people like policymakers in the state see this as being a really big opportunity to uplift this community. And that's why I think it's such an interesting case study, because it's kind of like, okay, there will be this big material demand. So is there a way to make it a win-win? And kind of how is that process developing? And how could it be supported, or sort of right now, I'm just kind of like, okay, what's going on down there? And that's basically what I'm going to talk about now. So the Salton Sea is located in Southern California. Here you can see the bottom right is or actually just the line across the bottom is the border between, between California and Mexico. The northern end of the Salton Sea is in Riverside County in the eastern Coachella Valley, and the southern end is in Imperial County. And one of the main issues in this region is public health, because the lake levels are receding and it exposes the shoreline and then generates kind of toxic dust that makes the air quality very bad. And there's a lot of respiratory health issues in the region. So a timeline of how the Salton Sea came to be: it's a basin that has periodically filled up and emptied over millennia as the Colorado River naturally changed course, and has been and continues to be occupied by the Coahuila people and indigenous communities for millennia. But the most recent version of the Salton Sea was formed in 1905. And back in those days was when people, like the people from the eastern part of the US wanted to come out to California. They built railroads, and then they were like, okay, we need people to be able to live here so that we can get our return on investment for these railroads. Let's make some massive cities in this place where there is very little water. So they built some very impressive feats of engineering of canals and dams and so on. And in 1905, one of the canals that was built breached and flooded the basin, and that's what created the most recent version of the Salton Sea. And then for a while, it was like a tourist attraction. You can see old videos of it. People were promoting it as kind of like an escape from LA, and you could boat and fish. And then as the water level started declining, two things that are happening is the salinity of the lake gets much higher, so it's no longer a suitable environment, habitat for fish. And then that in turn is kind of harmful to migratory bird populations that used to come. And then also you can see in this picture the kind of clay that's exposed next to the lake. So that's the playa that is being exposed as the water levels recede. And then mainly because of the composition of the Colorado River and the minerals that are in the lake bed, the dust that gets exposed as that recedes is toxic, and that's what creates this this serious public health issue. And then I have these transfers of water because that's also something that people bring up as part of the reason for the decline in the water levels. So finally in 2020 was when the Lithium Valley Commission was convened, and that's kind of where we are today. In terms of the people who live in the Salton Sea, there's a significant migrant population, and generally a lot of households there speak Spanish as their first language. A lot of people work in agriculture, and meanwhile, the average temperature is over 100 degrees for 4 months a year. So I remember when I was down there, some of the women who are in this meeting were saying they were looking forward to the fall because the temperature would get low enough that they could cook inside their homes. Because for the entire summer, a lot of people also live in mobile home communities, and it's so like there's not climate resilient housing that is suitable for such a hot place. And so you have these air quality issues, and then meanwhile people kind of have to spend time outside because it's too hot indoors, and they're working in agriculture. So all of these environmental justice and climate change situations are kind of like, I think, really intense here. And then meanwhile you have Palm Springs, like a few miles away, where there's golf courses and pools and so on. And I think context is important to know about, because on the one hand, this is why policymakers are so excited about the prospect for Lithium Valley to come and kind of provide a source of revenue to maybe address these challenges and provide employment and kind of uplift the region. And then on the other hand, this is also why people who live there are potentially skeptical of development and kind of very concerned about public health just generally kind of more cautious and skeptical of development. I kind of talked about this already. This is a picture of one of the geothermal power plants. The power plants are not, this is something that has come up a lot in meetings. The power plants are not actually in the sea or drawing water from the sea. They extract brine from several thousand feet below the sea that is superheated. That is brought up to the surface and used to generate power. And then after it has been used to produce steam, then the brine, which is basically mineral-rich water, can go through an additional processing step, which would isolate lithium and make it recoverable to produce lithium carbonate. So that's kind of how lithium would be extracted from the geothermal brine there. And at the moment, there are 3 companies who are interested in pursuing this. They have either as an addition to existing facilities or as a new facility, but they have not yet started construction of a pilot phase. So this is not something that is actually happening yet. And it's also a very new technology, and that kind of makes it challenging to have good answers about what are the impacts of this going to be, which is understandably what the community wants to know. This is another picture of one of the geothermal plants. It's hard to explain how wild it is to be there. I was driving around by myself and I was just like, it's all dirt roads. You don't see another person. It feels very eerie. And this is, you can see a lot of exposed clay here. So, like I said earlier, the legislature and the governor signed AB 1657 in 2020, which established the Blue Ribbon Commission. And this is a commission that's overseen by the CEC. It has appointees it has a community representative, an environmental group representative, representatives from the lithium and geothermal industry, tribal council members, economic development, and several public agencies. So the bill was pretty specific in trying to ensure that different groups would be represented. And they are charged with reviewing and investigating certain issues. The motivations in the bill, as specified in the bill, are kind of to look at ways to de-risk investment. And it's sort of like figure out how to make this happen in a beneficial way. And so they meet monthly. And their meetings are all on Zoom and open to the public. And so what I have been doing for the last, again, I have no idea how long, I don't know how much time, I don't know when time passes anymore. But I've been analyzing all of the transcripts of their meetings, and then also kind of comparing that with these community meetings that I've been able to observe, and kind of comparing the questions that people bring up in those meetings with what the commission's talking about. And there are, these are just some of the areas of alignment that kind of places where I can see how Lithium Valley would potentially kind of be a win-win for the electric vehicle industry, the state's decarbonization and grid flexibility goals, and the local community. One is employment, and they have been they've talked a lot about the efforts that the companies that hope to extract lithium are making to partner with local community colleges and invest in education in their region in order to be able to develop the local workforce and hire locally. So I think that's an area where it's been seen over and over that often people promise that they'll bring in jobs, then they end up kind of importing the workforce from elsewhere, and it doesn't actually benefit the local community. So they do talk quite a bit about how they hope to avoid that and how to invest in local capacity. Another interesting area is infrastructure. So as I mentioned, it's like a lot of dirt roads around this area, and there's also really bad internet connectivity, which has been identified as a struggle for the community, particularly during COVID. When school is online, a lot of things are online, and a rural community that doesn't have as good of internet access, it's a pretty significant challenge. And so something that has come up is that the infrastructure that would be required to support a lithium extraction industry would also be beneficial and kind of address some of these needs that have been identified by the community. A really big one is revenue, just by the tax revenue that would be generated from the lithium extraction. and the potential for that to support the school system, healthcare system, and then there have been ongoing efforts to address the ecological crisis in the Salton Sea that have kind of been underfunded or delayed for a long time. And so this is kind of also seen as a kind of like a saving grace to provide a source of revenue and fund a lot of those projects that need more support. And then the other area of alignment, at least in terms of topics of conversation, is the importance of community engagement. It's something that the Lithium Valley Commission has discussed frequently, and they have made attempts to make the process more accessible to the local community by translating the meetings into Spanish and also into Purépecha for a community meeting they had. And then they also held a community forum in November that was held from 6 to 8 p.m. To make it more accessible for people to attend. And they had live streaming locations for people who couldn't tune in on Zoom on their own. The asterisk is there because at the same time, there's also been pushback from some environmental justice advocates that the community engagement actually is not sufficient and that it's not giving the community actually space to provide their input and participate meaningfully. And I'm going to get into that on the next slide. So this graph, these graphs are meant to just kind of show what I see as a really key divergence between the community meetings and the Lithium Valley Commission. And this is something that has started explicitly coming out, like in this community forum, people made comments to this effect. But that is that the community, if you see on the bottom, their main concern is public health and what will the impact of lithium extraction be on public health. And they also didn't ask questions about employment and job quality and safety and whether there would be local hires, but it was relatively, health seemed to be top of mind for the local community. Meanwhile, in the Lithium Valley Commission, employment has been emphasized and discussed significantly more than public health. And I think there could be many reasons for that, but it kind of, at least for the people that I have been observing, who, to be fair, are probably represent some of the people who would be the most opposed to this kind of development. I'm sure there are many other people who either don't have much of an opinion on it or are in favor. But for people in this particular segment of the community, it's kind of like, we don't really care what jobs you say you're going to bring if this will sacrifice our public health at all. And I think that is something that needs to be deliberately addressed, especially if, like, people say that they don't expect there to be significant public health effects. It's just something that it's not like discussed in depth at this point. And I think that could be one reason why there has been some tension recently. Another really interesting distinction between the two groups is that they both, in terms of environmental impacts, the community asked a lot about how much water will the process consume, will it affect the water quality in the area, and where will the water come from? And then in the Lithium Valley Commission, water also was the most mentioned environmental topic. When I say most mentioned, what I did basically was there were certain keywords that I searched for based on different environmental topics. And so I searched and then coded all of those. So like if they said water, drought, things like that, I coded it as water, and then I read all of the quotations. So that is what I'm speaking from right now. But in general, most discussions of water in the commission were more to compare direct lithium extraction with evaporation or other methods. And just to, like, instead of saying this is the consumption of water, it was more, the consumption of water is so much less than evaporation, or it's so much less than hard rock mining. And the other main context was saying, like, this is how water rights work in the area, and Imperial Irrigation District has this much water set aside for industrial use. And so it was more like, if you were looking to produce lithium here, don't worry, there's enough, you'll be able to buy the water. So that's kind of, it's sort of like they both care about water, but they're talking about it in very different ways. And then finally, there was some feedback from the local community after this community forum that, well, they appreciated having the forum in the first place, but the format of it was that the commission, it was still a webinar style meeting, and so nobody could speak except for during the public comment window. And they didn't open public comment until there were only, I think there were like 30 minutes left in the meeting. So it was an hour and a half of just the Lithium Valley commissioners speaking, and not, it didn't read like they were looking for the input from the local community or to learn from them. It was kind of more like, here we are, here's the Lithium Valley Commission, and less of a two-way flow of information. And finally, there were a couple issues that the community brought up in their meetings that have not been discussed at all as during the commission, which is what the impact will be on cost of living. So if the lithium development happens, there's employment opportunities, people move in from outside. Is it going to drive up housing costs and kind of make the area unlivable for people who are currently there? And then another thing people brought up was that a lot of people who live there are undocumented and have therefore historically been ineligible to participate in some of these workforce development opportunities. So with all of that, like, okay, so now what do we do? And I think at this point, oh, there was one more thing that I forgot to mention, which is that when it comes to revenue, another kind of caveat is that all of the lithium, all the geothermal facilities are located in Imperial County, which means the tax revenue would primarily be going to Imperial County. And so therefore the communities that are on the northern end of the sea, unless there's like specific actions taken to make sure that they're also benefiting from lithium extraction, the benefit will kind of will be unequally distributed as well. And so this is where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is intense. We also do need to like electrify transportation. I'm just a PhD student. Oh my gosh. But some of the takeaways that I see here are, first of all, the local impacts of industrial processes are not well understood, particularly when it comes to health impacts. This has been in science and technology studies. This has also been analyzed as being kind of a structural knowledge gap, because funding for scientific research is usually from policymakers or industry, and the local health impacts are often not studied until something has been happening for a long time. But especially in this case, direct lithium extraction is a new technology. And so you kind of get to this point where the community is asking what the impacts on the water and air and so on will be. And it's just that nobody knows. So I think there is a really serious need to start looking at the local impacts of energy technologies to be able to answer these questions before something's already happening. Another takeaway is that comparing direct lithium extraction to other production methods is important for when you're trying to understand kind of the overall impact of batteries, or you're trying to compare one source to another, but it does not address a community's concern that something is going to negatively impact them. So if they're saying like, what is the water consumption of this? We don't have enough water here. We're all struggling from that. And the answer is like, oh, well, it's less than it would be if we made it in Chile. That is not, it's not really, those are two different things, and there's more information needed on the local concern. Something else that is just really interesting that I think comes out of this is the inherent tension in the urgency of addressing climate change, and the fact that we need batteries, we need lithium, and because of that, I am concerned that it could be an opportunity to kind of do things in a different way, but it also takes time to meaningfully, and resources to meaningfully engage a local community, and like the process might be slower than it is if you just kind of decide like, yeah, we've heard that the local impacts aren't bad and we know what's best, so we're gonna go ahead with it anyway. And I think that that's probably something that will continue to come up as we transition to this more material intensive and very urgent transition of our energy and transportation systems. And then finally, I think this is just, it kind of underscores how important it is to understand the social and historical context of a place where there will be environmental impacts, because then you can know like public health is top of mind for everyone who lives there, and so that needs to be evaluated carefully. Or people rely on agriculture for employment, and so water use needs to also be evaluated in the context of whether it will affect the agriculture industry. And then finally, thinking about how to bring it back to more like what we're doing, I think some ways that we can adapt at least industrial ecology research and kind of policy analysis is to include local impacts and not only compare products or technologies on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions, although those are also important. We also need to be still doing that. And then framing a results in a way that directly engages with the concerns. So yeah, like I just said, kind of reporting the water consumption in the context of other local water uses, so it's easier to understand. And then I think it also just shows like the Lithium Valley Commission doesn't have resources or staff dedicated to community participation, and so without having that funding, there may not be a lot more that they could do. And finally, I think it just shouldn't get lost that there are the prioritizing strategies that reduce material demand. Basically, that reduce energy demand is still really important, because whether that energy is met by fossil fuels or by batteries or renewable energy, it will have an impact. And so if you can figure out how to get people to have mobility or thermal comfort or lighting or the other things that energy provides us in a more efficient way, that also will ultimately reduce the demand for these materials. These are more resources. I'm also happy to share more of these at another time. And that's it. That's the presentation. Oh man, sorry, I totally didn't see these questions before.
No, Meg, that's fine. Jess and I were keeping an eye on the chat, so you did an amazing job. Firstly, thank you so much for an amazing presentation, and honestly, very well laid out. So bringing us from the very beginning historically, and really framing the issue before you started, delivering. So we do have a lot of questions and interest. So I think we'll get to those. But firstly, we definitely want to say thank you for an amazing presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I'll start with the questions in the chat. And then we'll go from there, okay? So firstly, we have from Gokul, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, from Enro. Could you elaborate more on the skepticism from the local inhabitants of the area? Why is that? So I guess I'll leave that to you. I think that was kind of in the earlier slide when that came up, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the came up later, but it was kind of, I think there's definitely concern over what the water usage will be because the area suffers from drought. And then some of it also just comes from a lack of clarity about the water sources and of brine and the processes for the lithium. So the water that will be consumed is not coming from the sea or from the groundwater table. It's coming from surface water from the canals that the local water utility has access to. But I think there's been alarm that it would lower the water level of the Salton Sea or generally kind of compete with water use in the area. And then I think part of it is also just that industries have come through the area before and used local tax incentives to establish industries and then not actually resulted in a lot of employment or benefit from the local community. And so some of the skepticism is kind of this like historical experience, and then at the same time hearing things like they'll ask what the waste stream is, and then the answer will be that like it's minimal. And so that for a lot of these questions where there just aren't really solid answers because it's a new technology, I think skepticism comes from that as well. But honestly, overall, I think really what it is that the sense that they've already, this was expressed in the most recent community forum, that it kind of just feels like they've already decided that this development is going to happen. Because the way that they talk about it is like, this is so great, we're going to bring these many jobs and we're going to support California's goals and so on. And it's framed like it's a foregone conclusion that lithium is going to be extracted. So some of the frustration is from that as well, I think.
All right, great. I'm glad to hear I pronounced it correctly. Okay, so I have a question from Christy. It's a little lengthy, Meg, so bear with us, but it's a very well laid out question. So here we go. How many jobs and what type of jobs would come to the community? Are they promising a share of careers to the community? I ask because in the Gulf Coast, often the oil and gas industry says that they will give jobs to the community they are in, but that does not actually happen. If they do get jobs, they are often low paying. And I think that was in a slide like kind of towards the middle.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that is something that definitely has been discussed by the commission and by the community as well. And they have provided, at least one company has provided numbers of construction versus full-time permanent employment and expressed that they want the full-time permanent employment jobs to go to local residents. But it's just, I mean, and then the other, aside from that, people also talk about ancillary industries, so kind of supporting in logistics or food service or hospitality or kind of other industries that would also grow as a result of having the people in economic activity, and that would create jobs as well. So I think they are promising a share of the careers to the local community in terms of operation and technician and the more skilled jobs as well as construction.
All right, that was a great answer. I think that we have a lot of thanks in the chat, of course. And I think I will open the floor now to anyone who wants to, verbally ask Meg any questions that I didn't have a chance to ask in the chat as of yet. Any concerns or maybe anything someone wants to add to that based on their experience or their research. We'd love to open the floor to that now.
Val here. Would the C Corp process address some of the environmental concerns, or Has that?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So the CEQA process does require a pretty extensive analysis of the environmental impacts in many of these different of these areas in terms, and if there is at least one company where their environmental impact report is available, and most of the impacts are found to be insignificant. And I think it's been kind of interesting to see how that has come up in the dynamics of this, because if you're like me and you have the time to read through their like 1,000-page environmental impact report, then you can get a lot of, and you also kind of know how to read those sorts of reports, you can get a lot of information from them. And that's also something that people have emphasized to respond to concern that California has really stringent environmental regulations and all the companies will have to comply with them. And I think what I see playing out here is that, like I said, such a long report is not necessarily accessible or easy to understand for someone who doesn't have a background in it or the time to really go through it. And then something else I'm seeing is that there have been requests for research that are not funded by the industry, who have to pay for the consultants to do their environmental impact reports. And that's a really interesting question, because it's kind of like, on the one hand, the burden of proving that something is safe should be on the developer, but then on the other hand, you have certain people in the community who don't trust it because it has been paid for by the industry. So that was a really long answer, but the short answer is yes, the CEQA process does address a lot of this, and those environmental impact reports are available.
Thank you, Meg, for that great answer. Does anyone else? Oh, there we go. Perfect. I'll allow you to go ahead and speak. Allow me back up. By all means, go ahead.
All right. Hey, Meg, this is Gokul from NREL. I hope my internet connection is going to be stable enough for me to let me ask this question. So without disrespect to how much people already know, has there been efforts to let the local community know the short-term benefits and the long-term benefits or the hazards of having lithium mining in the area? And I asked that because I wanted to set the context. In my community where I grew up in India, there was copper mining, which was prevalent, and a lot of community engagement efforts were quote unquote rigged by the company, in the sense that we had only 15 to 20 minutes to talk and we weren't given the full picture. And a lot of us didn't know the long-term health effects or detriments to mining in the area. And I was concerned / curious as to how that's addressed in the United States and the Salton Sea in particular.
Yeah, that is a really good question. So at the community forum that I mentioned, the purpose of that was to inform the community kind of about what's going on with Lithium Valley, what the purpose of the commission is, and what some of the potential impacts could be. I think so that is happening. And then also, like Val asked about the California Environmental Quality Act, and that requires the industry to like pretty rigorously analyze what the potential environmental and social and cultural impacts of development would be. I think that the challenge, one of them was I think that the way that information is presented in a community meeting needs to be much different than the way that it's presented at a Lithium Valley Commission meeting. So some of the informational presentations were pretty technical. There were a fair amount of acronyms and kind of a lot of language that requires a pretty strong background in geothermal and general energy knowledge to make sense of. So I think one of the challenges is kind of translating this technical process of direct lithium extraction and also building the capacity so that people are able to make more sense of the information, but kind of like reporting information in terms of, and so like just using more analogies, or like what is a ton of lithium, or what is 28 million tons of lithium. When they say that that's how much is going to be produced, like how many people does that employ and for how long, and kind of translating from the numerical impacts into what that would look like. I think that is really important. And then the other challenge is also that I think there isn't enough information about what the impacts are to be able to provide satisfying responses. And then finally, because it is more sustainable than alternative methods, what ends up happening is that instead of saying these are what the potential impacts are, they really just do say that like the potential impacts are basically nothing. And that may be true, but I think it's because the community is so concerned because of previous experiences and generally how these things often go. It's kind of like, it's not providing a satisfying answer for people who are concerned about it.
Got it. And sorry, if I might follow up, I don't need to take someone else's time.
I don't think anyone else has their hand raised, so.
Okay. So with the reports you were talking about, so how did they arrive at the impact? Was it modeled and juxtaposed with energy justice metrics and indicators, or where did the information come from?
I honestly need to read them better myself to understand that well enough to answer it. I think mostly it was modeled and not necessarily with the energy justice metrics. It was more like, it seems like there's certain models that are commonly used to assess air quality impact. And they would assess traffic impacts by modeling the increased transportation demand and associated emissions with that.